Hello, my friends. It's Sarah, of course, returning for our monthly Tudor Talk. So, I don't know whether we'll have folk in the house live this evening, but if we do, then you're most welcome. But I know most of you out there watch on catch up at your leisure. And of course, now you'll have the whole weekend to catch up on this talk. I can see we've got a couple of people join us. Hello, folks. Do say hello and let me know who's in the room tonight. It's very good of you, if you're in the UK, to be joining on a Friday evening. And I know, obviously, many of you over in the US are still in the midst of your working day. So maybe you're squeezing us in on a lunchtime. Anyway, you're most welcome. And if you are watching on catch up, you too are most welcome. For today, I'm very excited about today because we're going to be talking about Oxford, Tudor Oxford, which is not too far from where I live. So I've actually been holding on for a return visit to the city because I know our guest this evening is going to open my eyes to places and artefacts in Oxford that I thought I'd seen everything to do with Tudor Oxford. But I know from my preliminary discussions with our guest today that I haven't. So I've been holding on, waiting for this conversation this evening so that I can go back and make the most of my next visit there. And I hope that for those of you watching, you probably want to have a notebook and paper at hand because we're going to be going on a tour of Tudor Oxford. And our guest this evening, who's a very experienced tour guide, will be taking us to all sorts of different places. So you'll definitely want to have a notebook at hand. But as we go, of course, do remember that if you are tuning in live, do say hello. You can hopefully pop your chat or questions, any questions that you may have coming up. Feel free to note those down in the chat. I'll keep one eye on the chat and I'll be sure to ask them as we go. And as usual, we'll be running this for between 45 minutes up to an hour maximum. Usually stick quite strictly to that time so that you can plan accordingly. Okay, well, I think without further ado, I need to introduce today's guest. Now, we have with us today John Whitehead, and John is a historian. He's currently based in London, but he spent a lot of time in Oxford. He's a member of Oriel College and did his postgraduate research on Richard Fleming, who's Bishop of Lincoln. And I think John, as he will describe himself, is a medievalist rather than a Tudor historian. But of course, you very often get embroiled in both. John's background, apart from being a member of Oriel College, did a lot of tours in Oxford, first intermittently and then full time, looking at Oxford in general, but lots of different themed tours as well on historical periods and writers. Now, I first came across John doing my own research, and I came across his blog, Once I Was a Clever Boy, which I love the title of, by the way, John. And I found some really interesting stuff on there. And when I found out that John knew all about Oxford, I was really keen to bring him on here to be our virtual tour guide today. So just to finish off, telling you a little bit more about John, he's written a history on St Thomas's Church in Oxford, published in 2003, and given lectures on relevant topics to historical societies in Oxford and elsewhere. And in fact, John is not far from my original neck of the woods too. We're both from Yorkshire. John grew up near Pontefract, and of course the mighty Pontefract Castle was on his doorstep and has definitely inspired his love of history. So anyway, I hope I've covered everything enough there, John, and I'm going to bring you on now to say hello. Hi, good evening. Oops, hold on a moment, bring you on. Hello, hi.
Hello, good evening. Nice to be with you again.
Yes, it is. Sorry, I've done the wrong one, so I'm just going to do it. There we go. That's better. Then we're labelled properly. We're labelled properly. Yeah, thanks so much for joining us this evening on a Friday evening, giving up your precious time.
Always a pleasure to do that. I don't know how precious my time is these days.
Well, as I say, I genuinely am looking forward to finding out about Tudor Oxford. I dare say there's a lot of differences than it is today, but there's also a lot of buildings that still survive, and you're going to be taking us on a tour of the best of those and the best of the artefacts.
Yes.
So maybe I could start by asking you a question about, what did Tudor Oxford look like as a whole? if we were to approach the city, what might we see? What might we experience?
The most obvious thing I think you would recognise about the city as you saw it then was that it was a walled city. And in fact, a great deal of the wall still survives. Oxford is probably, along with Southampton, probably the best walled city in southern England. But most of the walls are hiding in plain sight behind later development, which actually happened in the Tudor period. So if you were coming into Oxford from any of the four cardinal points, no pun intended as a cardinal, because cardinal pop up in this talk,
Yes.
um, you would have come along the road from the north, south, east, or west. And as you approach the city, you would, for most of the Tudor period, it would be just as you would in the Middle Ages. You'd have gone along a road flanked by houses, but nothing behind them. So just sort of like ribbon development along the main road, so four suburbs. So if you were coming in from the north, I should perhaps just say that the wall, I say it's a walled city. And if you want to envisage what it would have looked like, I think the most obvious place to think of in this country would be Conway or Conway in North Wales, where they've cleared buildings in front. The walls at Conway are very similar to what survives that you can see very clearly in Oxford. So not like the great embankments we have at York or anything like that, but nonetheless a walled city with a ditch in front of it, and the ditch probably filling up with rubbish and not being cared for by the 16th century. Not because Oxford is not in the front line for military action in the Middle Ages. So if you'd come in from the north, if you'd come in from Woodstock, say like as Elizabeth I did in 1566,
Right.
if you come down through St Giles, which is a sort of an open market area stretching along the road north towards Woodstock, if you'd come down to the north gate of the city. And this was one of the four gates, principal gates. There was one or two little minor ones. And this was joined on to the tower still existing of St Michael at the north gate. The tower dates from about the year 1040, so that's pre-Norman conquest. And the archway was a fairly narrow archway across the road, but over it and to the other side, to the west of the gate, was the Bocardo prison. And that was where Latimer and Ridley and Cranmer were imprisoned in the period 1554 and until they were executed in 1555 and 1556. And that survived as a feature, and there are drawings of it, until 1771, when there was a fit of enthusiasm for road improvement in Oxford. And the old gateways were pulled down to widen the road for access. Fortunately, we have pictures of the North Gate. And if you go to St Michael at the North Gate, they have a doorway which was rescued from the old prison building. So there's a doorway there through which you can imagine that the door or the doorway that the three imprisoned bishops had walked through.
We don't know, can I ask, John, we don't know whether that's the main door to the prison or the door to their cell. We just know that it was a door that was part of the Bocardo prison.
It's an internal door, I think, yes. It's not, I don't think there isn't a lot of, some bits of the prison were still sort of revealed when they were doing some rebuilding work in the 1880s and so on. There's nothing there now. I'm sure if they actually, and you wonder they didn't when they were doing the pedestrianisation of that part of Oxford, if they dug down, you could find the foundations of the gateway, which must be there. You can and see on the tower of St Michael's a block doorway at ground level, and also one that's been a door at first floor level, which obviously has led into the prison. The tower was always part of the gate as well as part of the church, and that's an Anglo-Saxon arrangement that continues right through.
I see. So the two were together. So we've left with the church,
yes.
but the gate has gone,
Yes.
and the prison that was sitting above it has gone.
And the church is one of those churches that's got a bit of every style of English medieval architecture and quite a bit of Victorian renovation. And one thing that, again, might be of interest to people with Tudor specialists, the font in the church is not original church. It came from another church, St Martin's, which was at Carfax in the very centre of the city. But it's likely that by that font there stood one of the more famous Elizabethans, one William Shakespeare, when he was godfather to the son of the people who ran the inn that he used to stay in when he lodged in Oxford on his way from London to Stratford and back again.
Right.
a man called William Davenant, who went on to be a writer. So you can stand by by the font and think, well, I'm standing more or less by something, if not literally on the ground that Shakespeare had stood on.
And may I
So
ask just one more question before you go on, in case
yes,
we don't get to ask this, because I've been dying to know. Going back to the three martyrs
yes,
that were held. They were only held in the prison for a period of time. They were sometimes moved around, weren't they?
yes.
And I think, did Cranmer go and spend Christmas in one of the colleges in the dean's lodgings?
Yes, Cranmer was transferred. This was after Latimer and Ridley had been burned. He was transferred to Christchurch because his sister had never abandoned her Catholic beliefs, and she had actually been a nun. And she, I think, had tried to persuade her brother to listen to the various Catholic divines who'd been brought in. And so he was transferred to Christchurch and lodged there for a number of weeks in the time leading up to when he was actually burnt at the stake. So he was, and equally, we know they were taken out because in 1555 they were taken out to watch the Corpus Christi procession, and of course to ardent Protestants who had very different views about the Eucharist than the Catholic opinion, this was deeply shocking. So I think is Latimer sort of hiding himself in a doorway so he couldn't watch what he regarded as being a blasphemy in the Eucharist, when everybody else was kneeling down and adoring the sacrament, and he was burying his head in the doorway around. And there is next to the church, there is a bit of which, for all knows, that might have been which is now a pret-a-manger cafe, so which is a building from the 1390s. So. Yes, they weren't just cooped up in this prison and just taken out to be tried. There was some movement, and certainly there were disputations in the divinity school, which you can visit as part of the Bodleian, and the actual trial hearings took place in St Mary's Church. So they were backwards and forwards quite a bit. And generally, prison in the 16th century could often be a more relaxed regime than you might think for people. They might be let out or transferred to, say, other places. For sort of house arrest rather than durance vile. And we also know from the city records, for example, what they were eating, because the recorded payments were providing meals for the imprisoned bishops, and you even told me sweetmeats and nuts for them to eat and things like that. That's set out very much in Dermot McCulloch's book on Cranmer.
Right. Yes. Okay. So, with regards to Cranmer, you can go and see the door of the Brocado prison in St Martin's Tower. St Martin's Tower? Is that what you said?
In Michael.
St Michael's Tower. You
Yes.
can go and see the place where the disputations were. You can go and see where the trials happened at St Mary's Church, but you can't get into see the Dean's lodgings where Cranmer was taken during that Christmas period. That's private.
That is occupied. That is still the Dean's lodging at Christchurch. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And other things you can see associated with Cranmer, a slightly grisly relic, in that in the Ashmolean Museum is what is believed to be the base of the stake to which he was tied to be burnt. And this was found in the 19th century when they were resurfacing Broad Street.
Oh.
And they dug down and they found evidence of a pit of ash. And this stake. Now, again, this is my point about the ditch around the city. When the executions took place there, these were the only executions of that type to take place on the Broad. If anybody else was ever burnt at the stake in Oxford, which would possibly be for wives who'd murdered their husbands, that took place in a different part of the city altogether. So you can say, and the area is now constricted because the housing development against the city wall has narrowed Broad Street to only about half of the width that it was in 1555, 1556. So the engravings in Fox's Book of Martyrs show a much wider space, something like Smithfield in London, than you see today. And there's a cross in the middle of the road where the stake was, and there's a plaque on Oriel College. But in the Ashmolean is the base of what they believe to be the stake that was used, so that it can be seen as a relic of Cranmer, if you like.
I missed that. I love the Ashmolean Museum. I think it's a beautiful museum, but I completely missed that. So that's one of those things I really want to go back and see.
The Ashmolean when they had the huge renovation recently, they didn't do the best job in displaying things, and some of the medieval artifacts are displayed quite badly. One example of that in the Ashmolean is the sword, which is believed to be the one that was sent by Leo X to Henry VIII when he made him Defender of the Faith, and was presented formally in St Paul's in London. Well, now that is in a display case in the Ashmolean, but as far as I remember when I was there, it was sort of round the corner and not very well lit. And yet here you have this sword which you would expect to be still in the Royal Collection or in the Tower of London or something like that, which is a very handsome piece decorated with crystal and so on. And
Wow.
that is, it's there, but it isn't, they don't make as much of it as they should. And I know the medieval gallery, there was concern from several people, really, and the curator, yes, we need to actually rearrange it. So it may have been improved, the display, but when it was first set out, it wasn't as prominent as it should have been, and I think it's a pity. You need to keep a keen pair of eyes with you when you're going around the Ashmolean, otherwise you might miss something.
Yeah, there's two things definitely I need to go and seek out. Now, Fran, hello, Fran. I hope you're still here. Fran joined us and says, hello to you both. Is it known who founded Oxford University? Thank you.
It would take a lifetime to answer that. The university, there were in the Tudor period, they would have believed in almost mythical founders, that it was founded by characters from Geoffrey of Monmouth, and of course Geoffrey of Monmouth was writing in Oxford. And the actual university, it emerges in the 12th century. The official, very impressive history of the university, the first volume, the first chapter argues how it was founded in the first half of the 12th century. The second chapter argues, no, it was founded in the second half of the 12th century. My sort of a via media in this would be to say, I think that the key event is not, for example, is often claimed, Henry II forbidding English students to study at the University of Paris because of a spat with the King of France. I think it is that there were academics in Oxford, if you like, as freelancers in the early 12th century under Henry I. You then have the disruption of Stephen and Matilda. When Henry II comes to the zone, he brings peace and stability. And so people can travel, talk about using the roads to get to Oxford. And Oxford is at a focus of routes from the north to the south, from east to west, using the Thames Valley. And so that during his reign, so from 1154 onwards, it is easier for people to travel. There is a general, the 12th century Renaissance is flourishing. People are interested in learning. They want to learn. So that by the end of the century, by the time of Richard I, Oxford clearly is up and running in an informal way. And it has, I think, its first ever recorded foreign student, a man called Nicholas of Hungary. So its fame had spread right to Central Europe by the end of the 12th century. It's not until the very beginning of the 13th century, when there's been a dispute between the townspeople and the scholars, that the university is actually put on a firm footing as part of the dealings that are done by the papal legate after King John's reconciliation with the papacy in 1213. So that is when the university is actually put on a firm foundation. And it's during that period that some of the students, they had left Oxford because of this dispute with the townspeople. And some of them went off, and they found another place that was equally convenient for students to gather and to study, which was a place called Cambridge.
Little known place called Cambridge. Can I ask you, because I haven't looked into it, what was that? I know this is not Tudor history, but nevertheless, what was the fundamental dispute between town and gown that caused this split?
That is, again, there are a wealth of possibilities. I think, right, you have young men studying in the city to become clergy. They either have money, and it's possibly resented by the poorer townspeople. You've got these rich students, or you've got poor students who feel they're being ripped off by the rich townspeople. You've got also the culture of them and us. my gang, your gang, and town and gown fights of that sort went on right down to the 19th century. And bits of resentment were still there. And I remember talking to college porters who were saying, sort of 60, 70 years ago, when they were lads in the town, you were almost expected to get off the pavement, or thought you were expected to get off the pavement, if there were some university students coming towards
Is
you.
that so?
Remember that medieval students, Tudor students, would be on the whole younger than they are today. They'd be
Yeah.
basically secondary school age rather than undergraduate age, as we would think. Somebody of undergraduate age would be a graduate student, and so on. And also, there's the them and us thing. There's also, almost certainly, to be slightly savoury, there's doubtless competition for the local girls. Because the university is obviously all male. And yes, they're destined for the clergy, but they're also young men.
Mm,
And they're probably competition. And if they have more money, then they may be more attractive to the local girls. And so it's that sort of thing. It's the equivalent possibly of modern football rivalry in cities with two big football
yeah.
teams or something like
Right.
that.
Yeah, interesting. Now we were at the North Gate, and I know we are
Yes.
going through a tour through Tudor Oxford, but I highly anticipate we're going to go off down these various rabbit holes as my curiosity, and anybody, the folks who are listening, if you have any more questions as we go that you want to ask, do feel free to ask them, and I'll be sure at some point to slot them in for John to answer. So we're at the North Gate. Where would you take us then if you were showing us round Tudor
Well,
Oxford?
in theory, what I would do is actually, I think I'll take you around the outside and then we'll
Okay.
go into the city.
Okay.
So if we go then to the west gate, now that's hidden away behind the castle. And the plan of the Anglo-Saxon town had been more than slightly altered by the construction of the castle. So if you were coming in from the west to Oxford, that was probably the least important route, because if you were travelling to the West Country, you would probably use the north or south roads and then turn up. But the west road, because you had to cross a great number of streams of the Thames, which divides at Oxford into about 7 or 8 courses. And so the road to the west, or from the west, went over these various bridges. And it seems to have been not in the best of repair. When in 1560, Amy Robsart died at Cumnor Place, just to the west of Oxford, they had to actually strengthen the roads to bring her funeral car in for her ceremonial funeral in St Mary's Church. And down there, because it was marshy ground, and you got all intriguing things off there, such as the chapel associated with St Friedwide and her holy well at Binsey, was very marshy and boggy. And the drainage channels would get blocked up with the reeds growing in them. Then they say, well, we've got to cut the reeds. So they'd cut them, but then they'd just leave them. So you get the impression that part of West Oxford at times was like living on top of a sort of soggy compost heap. And then you've got, the stench of rotting vegetation, and you'd get malaria and all that sort of thing. It's a slummy area. But if you come into Oxford from that side, pick your way through this compost and so on, you would have seen at the beginning of the Tudor period, to the right-hand side, you'd have seen Osney Abbey, which was the largest monastic church in Oxford, the largest church in Oxfordshire. At the dissolution, it was saved temporarily and became the cathedral of Henry VIII's new diocese. And then, that was 1542. In 1545-6, he moves the cathedral into St Friedwide Priory, which is part of his new foundation of Christ Church, and Osney is dismantled. Now, one of the sounds of Oxford is Great Tom, the bell in Tom Tower at Christ Church. That is actually the great bell of Osney Abbey, which has been melted down and recast numerous times. Hence, if anybody's the sung round, Great Tom is cast. But when you hear Great Tom sounding, it is still actually the bell metal of the medieval great bell of, I think it's dedicated to St Thomas of Becket, and much to the horror of Henry VIII, the bell associated with his college is actually, his Great Tom. It's not somebody, it's Great Tom. It wasn't Thomas Wolsey. It may actually be Thomas Becket.
Yeah, wow.
And what was left of Osney Abbey was destroyed in the Civil War, or at least the tower, because the royalists were afraid that it would be used as an outwork by the parliamentarians when besieging it. But we have a drawing of the tower, and there is a very fine, very impressive reconstruction of what the abbey looked like done beginning of the 20th century. And it was a majestic church, of which the site is now covered by a graveyard. And so the only experiment had been that somebody in the early 20th century used to go and ask the grave diggers when they'd found any bits of stone and plot them on a map to reconstruct the plan. And if you travel into Oxford Station by train from the south, you're actually going through the Lady Chapel of Oseney Abbey. So
Really?
was it is one of the great losses in Oxford.
Yeah.
So you just see that. And at the other side, where there's now the business school, you would have had another abbey, a Cistercian abbey, which was founded for Cistercians who wanted to study in Oxford. So it was very much an outcloud of the city with these two monasteries. And then you'd have gone along through the St. Thomas's suburb, round past the castle. And at that side, the castle still looks like a castle with quite high walls and the one surviving tower, St. George's Tower. And then the road snakes round, and the exact position of the West Gate isn't very clear to see, because there a lot of modern development has mucked up the original road plan, so it's more difficult to see exactly what it would have been like. And you're surrounded entirely by modern buildings up there. But as I said, the castle was important in the Tudor period, not as a residence. It served basically as the county jail, and it was the place where the assizes were held. Most notoriously, I think it's 1579, the Black Assizes, when an outbreak of plague came along with the assizes. So many of the judges and the prisoners and the jurors all died of plague. It became part of the folk memory of the town.
Oh gosh.
But that is.
Can I just ask? Yeah, can I just ask? It would have been pre-Tudor period, therefore. But who was the noble family that kind of were the overlords of Oxford Castle back in when it was a castle?
The castle was built by Robert Doye. I think there are two Robert Doyes, and it's normally dated to, I think, 1071. It's built at the command of William the Conqueror. And it then, I'm not sure, by the 12th century, it really is a royal castle. But like many castles in county towns, it wasn't a great residence. It wasn't like the Tower of London or, Dover or somewhere like that would be used by the king. It was the ancestor really of the county council officers or the
right.
Crown Court today. It wasn't really a residence. St. George's Chapel, which was a feature of it, nearly became a college under Henry V, but it's not. It's say an administrative office. It's not anything particularly. And they say although it's associated with Robert Doye and his wife is the founder of Oseney Abbey. Thereafter, it's really run by the sheriff on behalf of the crown.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And I suppose the other question I have is sort of about, since it's just coming up in my mind, about royalty. Oxford was a kind of a royalist city in the Civil War.
Yes.
I know we're straying into a different period, perhaps. But I've got two questions. One is about why was it a royalist city? Why did it have that association so strongly with the crown? And just perhaps while we're thinking about it, from a Tudor point of view, were any of the Tudor monarchs more affiliated with Oxford? I know, for example, Henry VII, I think, started connected to Oxford, but then kind of, probably under the influence of his mother, ended up being more of a patron of Cambridge, which was a bit of a source of contention. Were any of the Tudor monarchs particularly affiliated with Oxford and its history? So two questions there.
Yes. The first one about the connection generally between Oxford and the crown. It's thought that until the time of Edward I, English kings didn't actually set foot in the walled city of Oxford because of the story of St. Friedeswide, who the idea that an Anglo-Saxon female saint was a powerful woman. She wasn't just a shrinking violet on the banks of the Thames. She was a powerful woman. She was of royal ancestry herself. And that because she had fled from Algar of Leicester, who had wished to sort of abduct her and marry her against her will. And he'd been punished by being struck blind. So the fear was that if you entered Oxford and you were on the wrong side of St. Fried's and you were the king, you might be struck blind. So it wasn't until Edward I that he actually had picked up the courage to say, be blown to that, I'm going into the city. And so for that, the connection in the Civil War, and that possibly explains it, is that the town, it's more difficult to tell how that was affected. There, the townspeople seem possibly, and this may come back to town gown rivalry, to have been more inclined to the parliamentarian cause, and certainly some of the leading figures on the city council were. Whereas the university had always been close to the crown, because the crown from the 12th century onwards encouraged the university, because they meant they had a rival to the King of France and his university in Paris. And whenever there was trouble between the town and the gown would, write a letter of complaint to the king, and the king would always intervene on behalf of the university, because he was seeing it as if like a national asset,
Right.
or
Okay.
a regional asset, and therefore the king supported the university. And every time you got these up here in the Middle Ages, famously in 1355, the St. Scholastica's Day riots, where they actually have to remember there isn't a standing army, but they rush the guards in from Woodstock to bring peace to the city because it is so out of order. And the university was shaking because the townspeople thought they'd got the upper edge. And a new charter is granted, which strips away even more of the privileges of the town vis-a-vis the university. And from then until the 1820s, on the anniversary of the riot in 1355, the townspeople city council had to go to St. Mary's to a formal service of penance for this, and in fact basically told off being what naughty boys they had been by attacking the university, which was a national asset. So the university was very much, and in the post-Reformation era, the university, of course, was training the clergy of the Church of England. And by the time of Charles I, the chancellor of the university was Archbishop Laud, and it was seen very much as being, it was, if you were a student at Oxford, then you were loyal to the king and the church, which was under attack from the parliamentarians. So Oxford had that very much more high church tradition, which in the 17th century became high church Toryism. In the 18th century, certainly the early 18th century, a lot of Oxford was Jacobite in sympathy, for example. So you have that tradition. And you could put it slightly in modern left and right in that sense, but it's concerned with guarding your privileges as community, whether it's the community of the town or community of the university. And specific connections of monarchs to Oxford. Henry VIII clearly is patent because he takes over Wolsey's foundation of Cardinal College to create Christ Church. Other monarchs are, Elizabeth I is sort of reckoned to be notionally the foundress of Jesus College, but in fact it's really founded by a Welsh clergyman who wants to found a college for people from Wales, because the colleges tended to be for people from specific parts of the country. And Elizabeth visits us in 1566, and then again in the 1580s. There isn't that much connection, but there's still a presumption of royal favour towards the university. And the colleges, if, say, you founded a college in the Middle Ages, you might associate the king with you as being a sort of honorary co-founder. In the case, say, of Merton, where there's a statue of Henry III outside. My college, Oriel, was founded by Adam de Broom, and then 18 months later he handed it over to Edward II, who refounded it. So we are the oldest royal foundation with a continuous history in either Oxford or Cambridge. So that there is that, because in a sense Oxford and Cambridge are national assets, and that's something that the king wants to, or the Queen wants to encourage, rather than being sort of a purely personal thing.
I think I'm probably taking you off piste, and I'm also where we're halfway through our chat, and at least we need to get round the circumference of the walls. But I keep taking you down rabbit holes, so I'll shut up for a moment to let you carry on.
Going down rabbit holes is a very Oxford thing to do, Alice.
Oh yes, of course it is.
We've never fallen into the treacle well down at Binsey. If we go down to the south side, coming in from there, from Abingdon, you would come along the Grand Pont, which had been built by the Doyes to get across again those many streams of the Thames, until you came just about where the main course of the river is, to what was nicknamed by the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, Friar Bacon's study, which was actually a defensible gatehouse on the bridge into the city. That was also pulled down in the 18th century. We have pictures of that. And then you've gone across there and you've climbed up the hill towards Christchurch, or in the early years, the Tudor period, St. Friedwide's Priory, to the south gate of the city, which survived at least until the early 1670s. It's not quite clear whether it disappeared at that time, but there's nothing visible of it now. It's not quite clear where it stood. Again, there are probably foundations below the modern road surface. And that was, again, between one of these suburbs and then the actual walled area of the city. And off to the left, in the early 16th century, you'd still have had the Dominican friary and the Grey Friars, Franciscans. Those disappear very rapidly. Their buildings were nothing like as substantial as those of something like Osney Abbey or St. Friedwide's, and the buildings were cannibalized for redevelopment in the city. There's a few tiny bits you can just pick out of Greyfriars. I don't think there's anything visible above ground of the Dominicans at all. And so on the south side, and there the city was defended, yes, by walls, but also because you had the floodplain of the river, you could actually, if need be, flood that. And so you still have open spaces there, like Christchurch Meadow and so on. And if you walk down there, you can see the city, and the low wall in front is the line of the city wall.
Uh-huh.
If you go around to the east, if you come in from London, then you come down basically through Headington, which is the eastern suburb of Oxford, but not on the present road, which I think is a 18th century, 19th century road improvement. But you'd come along what is still called Old London Road, which is shown in 18th century engravings, where you'd have had, you'd have a lovely panorama of the city. That's now hidden because the city has expanded across there, and it's obscured. But that clearly was something there it is, and you'd seen the city all laid out before you. Now you come over Headington Hill and you sort of see Oxford in the valley below you. And then you again come to one of these rather run-down suburbs, named after the parish church of St. Clement's. And then you'd come across the River Cherwell, past Magdalen College, and you'd come to the East Gate, which the only pictures we have of that are from just before that was demolished in the 1771 scheme. And that looks to my mind as rather like a Tudor rebuilding, mainly as a ceremonial entrance with those huge, almost triumphal archways, so that if the king comes to Oxford, or if you're visiting, the mayor to enter in triumph after his visit to be confirmed in London and so on, it doesn't look like a medieval gateway. It looks like something that's a bit of a sort of almost like a stage set and so on.
Uh-huh.
But that was the other gateway. But there, and from there, going round to the north again, in the grounds of New College, there you can see extensive pieces of the city walls, because the agreement was made that the college would maintain the city walls, and they've done it ever since. And every 3 years, the city council goes along in full costume to inspect that the walls are still being maintained.
Is that right? Okay.
I have seen my tutor in paleography, who was a city councillor, going off in full gown and bicorn hat to inspect the city wall.
I love that.
So you have things like that, and that is so. And that circuit you can follow. There's quite a good thing online which tells you where you can find bits of the city walls, and that helps define what you're looking at. And the comparison is that if you look at the map of the city that's done in bird's eye, it's not just a flat plan, but it's bird's eye view, done in 1578 by Ralph Agas. It is very much a walled city with these 4 suburbs going out. If you look at the one done about 100 years later by David Logan in 1675, it's much more built up because the population has expanded, and it's thought that the population more or less doubled between, say, 1580 and 1630 in that 50-year period.
So what kind of population will we be looking at in 1580, just to give us a kind of
well, thought is, say, in the early Tudor period, you're talking population for the town of being about 3,000. Then maybe if you were, say, 1,000 people for the university, which come and go. It's not until the 1560s that it begins to rise. And then it seems to be from 1580 to 1630, there is a big expansion of the city population, and houses being squeezed in. And whereas if you look at the map of 1578, there are a lot of vacant lots within certainly the eastern half of the city, which are obviously just gardens or what have you. And some of them are now the origin of the college gardens. And that's still, you still get traces of that in the area down Merton Street, for example. But you get a lot of houses crowded in, and many of the streets in Oxford, the buildings might look only 19th century or late 18th century. But in fact, if you realise the facades are just that, they are a facade. There's a much older timber frame building underneath. And we know that in the Civil War, there was a severe fire, I think 1644, which devastated part of the area behind where the Oxford Union is today. And a lot of houses were destroyed at that time. And in that period, people were, they were sort of rooming together, crowded into small spaces in the city. Royalists had come to support the king because there really wasn't much space. And Oxford doesn't really expand physically as a city, really, until the 19th century. Even the Oxford of, say, the young John Henry Newman in the 1820s, 1830s, was still more or less the same size as it had been in the Middle Ages.
So I'm really mindful of time, and
yes.
I really, really would like to talk about, is it St Mary's Church, where
yes.
I think there's so much history centred on that, and I think it's so easy to miss it. I was blown away when I realised that this is where Cranmer's trial and stuff. Can we talk about that and really point out the different history associated with it, and what you can see inside when you visit?
Yes, St Mary's is the mother church of the university. The university didn't have permanent buildings, so that was where they had degree ceremonies. It was where you had the matriculation ceremony at the beginning of your course. One building to the one side, which is the old Convocation House, which is where they had the weekly meetings to administer the university. But apart from that, and the Divinity School, and then the library, which moved from St Mary's in the 15th century to Duke Humphreys, which is the heart of the Bodleian, in 1488. Apart from that, there were no university buildings. So you took over, because they were all churchmen, they met in a church, and St Mary's was the biggest and most impressive church. The tower and spire are well established by the Tudor period. They're built in the 14th century. The chancel of the church was rebuilt after 1462. The nave is Tudor, and that's rebuilt in the 1490s. So that's from the reign of Henry VII. Right. And the church has gone through a lot of alterations since. But there are still links to that. In the nave, there is one of the bases of one of the pillars has been cut away, and it's claimed, I'm not absolutely convinced of this, but it's claimed that this was done to install the platform that Cranmer stood on at his final appearance in the church before he was taken out to be burnt, when he was formally degraded from his holy orders. And that is almost opposite the pulpit, and there's a little plaque there. And next to it, on the wall behind, there's another plaque commemorating people from all traditions from the Reformation era and Civil War era who came to violent deaths, who got Oxford links. So Catholics, Protestants, and various shadings in between. So you can see that it's so there's that sort of bit of battered stonework and a little photograph of Cranmer, so you can imagine him standing there on that occasion. And it is said, I'm not convinced, because I haven't seen that in the chancel, the heads of the bench ends of the choir stalls, that the headpieces were sort of taken off to put in extra seating for actually the trial of the bishops. I'm not convinced of that. I think it might have been that they actually are of vandalism and so on.
Right.
But there you certainly, and so you get it. The church, I'd say, has been reordered several times. I mean, in the early 19th century, and then again in the 1930s, 1920s, 1930s. So that it's the stonework is there, the shape of the building, but it's not. The layout is not as it would. It's a bit difficult to mentally reconstruct what it would have been like in the mid 1550s.
So just to be clear for everybody, the bishops were taken there for their trial, but they were also taken on the morning of their execution for, as you said, what did you call it? The disrobing?
Well, they were actually degraded from their status as clergy, so they would be dressed up in sort of cheap versions of vestments, which would then be ceremonially removed of chasuble and stole and so on, and even get down to sort of scrubbing their hands to remove any trace of the oil when they had been consecrated and so on. So this was a ritual degradation which would take place, and then they were handed over to the secular arms for secular punishment.
And can you follow in their footsteps from that church to where they met their end?
You can. It's not quite clear. I sometimes used to wonder about which route, because the case of Cranmer, because with him is sort of recounting his recantation, having at the last moment, they sort of hurried him out of the church. So you could, because the street plan of Oxford, most of it has not changed. So you could imagine if they went up the high street and then either along Cornmarket, past the Picado prison to the stake, or along the Turl, where there was a small gate at the end, or whether they'd have hurried them through what is now an open space, Ratcliffe Square. It wasn't open in quite the same way in those days. Past Brasenose College, up Brasenose Lane and into the Turf. You can do that, and you can, when you walk the streets of Oxford, you are walking in the footsteps of many, many famous people. But yes, you can begin to imagine what that would have been like on that day. And,
I found it very dramatic when I went, and as I said, it was quite. I'd only just suddenly realised, oh my goodness, this happened here, and he's such a giant of the Tudor age. I really urge people to go along. I think it's a place that people really, Tudor lovers, don't really appreciate. Many people don't appreciate it's there, and that you can go and visit.
I think, yes, I think St Mary's, it suffers slightly, I mean, a bit like Christchurch, from having almost too many tourists, in that the people flock in and out. I mean, they have, I can say, they have good things, but they have leaflets, they have a very good sort of souvenir shop. They also have normally a good cafe, that I think is temporarily closing for a major refit. But it also, I've taken groups there, and you have to find a corner to sit your party down and give them a mini lecture, and there's everybody else milling round you, and it's you are surrounded by so many different ghosts from the past. Yes, there are the ghosts from the 1550s. There are the people, say, from the Oxford movement, and people point out that probably no church in the country has had so many distinguished preachers over the centuries as St Mary's. So there's a lot there, and it's probably a case when I've been taking parties around myself. Often you found I'm not giving this enough time. You really need to sort of go there, possibly find a pew at the back of the church, take in other things like the fact that there's a special throne for the vice chancellor and the proctors at the back and so on, and they'll sit there and possibly almost like a pious exercise. You sort of meditate on the guidebook and think of how many, say the shades, let's not use the word ghost, shades of so many people are around you, and it is seen and witnessed so much as a building.
I must admit, I must have been lucky. I was there early on a Sunday morning, and we practically
Yes.
had the place to ourselves. That's
Yes.
but it was. I think it was first thing in the morning. We were quite lucky, or maybe it had even been a Saturday first thing. I can't remember, but
Yes.
we were lucky. But I also want to come back to another lady who you mentioned her earlier, and I only just realised she was buried there, and that's Amy Robsart.
Yes.
Maybe you could tell us, first of all, Cumnor Place, was that a Leicester, as in the Earl of Leicester's house, or was she staying with? Do you know what she was doing there?
But their marriage had more or less broken down, and she was renting the house. I mean, she was a lady of some independent means, I think, even though obviously notionally her assets would have been administered by her husband. That Cumnor Place, it was 2 or 3 miles outside Oxford. The pictures that survive of it, it's again, the point again, it's the medievalist in me coming out. It is a medieval house. It's not a big Tudor house in the sense that you think of one of the, sort of Robert Smithson type building.
Yeah, the Prodigy House.
It's a rambling medieval house around an open courtyard. And it's there are some fragments of it in the churchyard at Cumnor, I think, which were rescued. The house survived. I mean, it survived long enough for people to do drawings of it, but then it just disappeared. So yes, Amy Robsart was living out there, but it wasn't really. I think it was a place that she was actually renting or had on loan from somebody. It wasn't a Dudley property. It was actually something that's more connected with her own family.
And that's the place where she was found at the bottom of the stairs with her broken neck.
Yes.
And she was taken and buried in St Mary's. But
yes.
I think if I remember rightly, because I was having a read of this, they don't know where her body is, but there is a plaque somewhere in the church.
There's a plaque. I think there's a slab just inside the communion rail in St Mary's, and it just says Amy Robsart. I think it uses her maiden name rather than her, because that's what she's best known as. I mean, it doesn't actually. I mean, if you like her proper name, it would be Lady Robert Dudley at the time.
Of course, yeah.
And I think there's a little plaque on the wall just saying, which is about the size of a postcard. And you suddenly realise that it is there. I mean, there are records of this because he wasn't at that time. A few years later, of course, Robert Dudley actually became Chancellor of the University and so on. So there's a relatively strong connection there. Presumably, it's known that she was buried there, but whether or not, no one, I think, has ever actually sort of dug her up and tried to see, they can work out anything from her bones and that sort of thing. Although, of course, it was a current academic in Oxford who actually found her coroner's inquest report, and which is cited in an academic I know, and it's cited in Chris Skidmore's book on her death and so on. It's and it is claimed by some people that her ghost sort of haunts the Chancellor of St Mary's.
All right,
and that, for example, they'll have got everything ready, the night before for a service, and then they go in the next morning, things are all disturbed. And people who claim to be able to pick up these things have said that they have sensed a presence there. I mean, I'm relatively open-minded on that, but it again is not something like a lot of things. There is so much there that if it was somewhere else, she would be probably celebrated more that she was buried there, but in fact she isn't, because so much else has happened in St Mary's.
And interestingly, what's interesting to me is Robert Dudley didn't choose to put a fine tomb up. I mean, there was all sorts of controversy over her death. You might have thought that he would try and sort of, no, I really do love her, by putting a lovely tomb up, but unless it got destroyed.
That is true. Yes, there is. It's there may be a cultural, and this might be something that is that maybe in 1560 people they may be more sensitive about putting up monuments to the departed, because they might associate that with praying for the
Mm.
dead, whereas that is out of fashion under the new Elizabethan settlement. But
Mm.
certainly, there's nothing like his own tomb and his second
Exactly.
wife,
Yeah,
Lettice,
exactly.
in
Yeah. Lettuce.
in Warwick.
Yeah.
It's yes, I mean, reading about that, I'm very, very inclined to think that Robert Dudley, I don't think he was responsible for her death, because it would be too
No.
obvious if he was. He
Yeah.
does seem to have been genuinely surprised by this, even if they were estranged. Who you want to point the finger at is
Well, that's one of
another thing.
those mysteries.
You could have one of your weekend conferences about
Yeah,
that.
indeed, a whole
Um,
weekend. Yes.
but it's yes, it, you know, it is it's a strange story, because the story that she was so anxious that all the servants should go
Mm.
to the fair in Abingdon. She was clearly expecting somebody to come to see her,
Mm.
and she didn't want it to be owned. So there is a mystery there. I've only read part of Skidmore's book, but yes, but certainly if you're looking for that connection, and I say it's ought to remember that Robert Dudley did go on to be Chancellor of the University, because by that time, again, you talk about the links between the Crown and the University. From his appointment, he's the first, I think, really secular Chancellor of the University. And from then until really to the present age, it's normally who's a major political figure is Chancellor of the University, because the university is an important institution, and the government, the Crown, wants to keep an eye on it. And so that now, of course, the university is, in that sense, isn't controlled in that way. But that's still that feeling that you ought to have somebody who is a man of great consequence. Yeah, you
Mm.
do have some ecclesiastical chancellors after, but they're also very highly politicized figures like Archbishop Laud or Archbishop Sheldon in the mid 17th century, and so on. So Dudley has that connection, and I suppose also he could have visited Oxford on his journeys, say between London and Kenilworth, because
Yes.
it would be on
Yeah.
the route.
Well, I have to say we've got 3 minutes left.
Oh,
Fran was saying thank
there's
you
so
for
much
bringing.
more to talk about.
I know. I've got a feeling that we could go on for another hour here. Maybe we need a part 2. Maybe. At some point.
Maybe. I'd be delighted to do it. Yes.
That would be
Um,
lovely. That would be lovely. I just wanted to give you a chance, to really just. Is there any other artifact that, as a Tudor lover, you have to see? We've already mentioned, 2 or 3. Any other absolute must-see
I
Tudor artifacts?
I think there you would have to say you've got to go to the History of Science Museum, which is next to the Sheldonian. It's the oldest purpose-built museum in the world. It's still a museum. And if you go up to the original top room, the home of the Ashmolean, there you can see Cardinal Wolsey's sundial, which is a piece made by Nicholas Kratzer, who was a German instrument maker working in Oxford, brought to Oxford probably by Wolsey, and it's got 9 sundials on this thing. It's Cardinal Wolsey's desk toy, really, but it's something you could have on a desk, and you could tell them. I think it obviously tell the same time, and it's probably Kratzer showing off his skill. Some people think it's a bit crude, but it's clearly engraved with a cardinal's hat and the arms of the See of York, and it was found by the man whose collection is at the heart of the Science Museum's holdings. He bought it secondhand, well, obviously secondhand, from somebody near Peterborough in about 1900. Nobody knows where it had been between 1530 and 1900, but there it
Amazing.
is.
Amazing.
And he's just sitting there in a showcase. And you think, that was on Wolsey's desk. He's got that in front of him when he's worrying about how he's going to negotiate with Clement VII about the divorce of Catherine of Aragon, and Cardinal Campeggio is due next week, and all that sort of thing. And if you go in the entrance hall of the Museum of History of Science,
Have we lost John for a moment?
again, something that I used to work there, is that really ought to be appreciated more, is a marble copy of the Holy Table of Dr. John Dee. And this was the thing that he made. John Dee, of course, Elizabeth I's tame astrologer and an advisor and so on, that he had created this idea that if you could converse with angels, then you could understand how creation came to be, because the angels had been in on the act, more or less, or at least before the fall of the angels and before the fall of man. So therefore, they could tell you more about how the world was. Now, this strange tablet, which is about the size of an A3 sheet of paper, it's in marble. It's a copy probably made in the 1650s, the original wooden one. But this was revealed to Dee by his rather curious assistant, Edward, I've forgotten his surname now. And now how it operated, I don't know. I also wonder if it was something like a Ouija board that you sort of turn it, and because there are these strange characters, but the idea was that you could somehow converse with the angels and say understand the mechanics of creation. Now, you might think that sounds very silly to the modern man, but in fact that was cutting edge mixture between science and theology in the late 16th century, and that was their worldview. And it's not something that it sounds a bit ridiculous when you say talking to angels in that way to many people, certainly in this country today. But actually, that's to completely misunderstand the significance of what John Dee was about. And the fact that he was not only supported by Elizabeth I, but then he spent time at the court of Rudolf II in Prague, and has this. He has got the entree. He crops up everywhere, does John Dee, and he's remarkably interesting character. So that's, and again, you can see in Oxford, and like some of the other things, they are not things that you've got sort of flashing lights and arrows telling you this is what you must see. You've got to go and look for it. You've got to go and search them out for yourself in Oxford.
Yeah.
So those I think, and the one other thing I would mention that we talked about beforehand is that if you go to St. John's College, which was refounded in the 1550s, if you go there, it's a bit. You have to go on the penultimate Saturday of term, so a Saturday late in November, Saturday in mid-March probably, or one in mid-June. They have the exhibition of what they call the Laudian vestments, which are vestments associated with Archbishop Laud from the 17th century. But with them are two banners that were hung in the chapel of St. John's when it was rededicated to St. John the Baptist in 1557. And so you actually have two church textiles surviving from the reign of Mary I, which, because they were hardly ever used, have survived in very good condition. And those are, again, you go back to that world when in the time of Mary I, and Trinity College and St. John's College are founded to re-Catholicize the university. These are things that would probably have been seen by people like St. Edmund Campion, who was at the college a year or two later. And so there are things and that's something, if you want to go and see that, you probably would need to ring up St. John's College, or send them an email and say, when are the Laudian vestments going to be on show? Because we would like to see them. If people are thinking of bringing a party, then you could possibly arrange a party visit to go and see them. And they are an very interesting display. And I say they also have relics associated with, this is straying into much more modern times, to the 1630s and 1640s, but things associated with Archbishop Laud, including his skull cap and so on. So there are things like that. So that's all, again, things where you actually have something that is tangible.
Thank you. So I think our time is definitely up, but we did cover. We got round the walls, and we got to talk about St. Mary's Church, which has so much important history, and we also got to cover at least sort of 5 or 6 different artifacts, as you say, John, are not something that I think many people realise that are there. You have to go on your own little quest, but that makes it all the more delicious, I think, when you actually find them.
Absolutely.
So I just want to thank you for your time today, and I just want to say again that your blog, if anybody wants to read some of your pieces, it's Once I Was a Clever Boy. Have you got a URL? What's your www? Is it just onceiwasacleverboy.com?
Once I Was a Clever Boy, yes, which is a quotation from my Bishop Fleming, who was the man I'm researching. Yes,
that's lovely. And as I say, maybe there is room for a part 2 next year. We could revisit and finish off Tudor Oxford. That would be delightful.
I don't think we'd ever finish off Tudor Oxford, but we can carry the mission forward.
Okay, right. Okay, so I'm just going to switch the view, and if I'm just going to say cheerio, John, thank you so much. If you just hang along for a moment while I say goodbye to folk that are joining, that would be lovely. So there we go, folks. Okay, well, thank you to those of you who joined in live. I know Fran's here, and I know Laurie's here. So lovely to see you in the room today. And for those of you who are watching on catch up, thank you so much. I hope it's piqued your interest to go perhaps a little bit off the usual tourist trail in Oxford. I know it has for me. I literally have learned about new artefacts that I need to go and root out. So if you had a pen and paper and you've made notes of some of that, if not, you've got to come back and watch it all again. Okay, my friends, well, we will be returning next month with Tudor Talk, and we're due to head over to Ipswich to talk with Phil Roberts, who is a historian and who does a lot of reenacting and has written a book about Cardinal Wolsey. There's a lot going on in Ipswich this year because it's a big anniversary associated with Cardinal Wolsey. So we're going to be talking to Phil about Wolsey and Wolsey's Ipswich. So I hope you can join us next month. And just keep a lookout in the membership on the dashboard. As you know, I will switch things around and you'll be able to see a little bit of information about next month's Tudor Talk, and I'll be sending out emails as we get close so that you know that it's happening. All right, my friends, wherever you are in the world, it's been lovely to see you and spend an hour with you, and have a good rest of the day. Bye.